Olga from Minerva. In today's video, we're going to be doing a sew along for this really stylish jacket. This is the McCall's 7513 jacket, and it comes in 4 views. All 4 views feature the same top of the jacket, so we have the same color, shape, the same V, and they all feature the same sleeves as well. The only difference is in the peplum. So all of them have a sort of peplum. A few of the techniques we use in this jacket are going to be more advanced in the wheelhouse of tailoring and more structured garments. And I feel like if you are new to that, and if it's something that you want to, try dipping your toe into making a structured blazer or something a bit more tailored, I think this would be a really good starting point because it is a little bit more challenging than your regular, dress, but it also isn't super difficult. So I think it would be really, really nice for somebody who is looking to expand their knowledge. The suggested fabrics for this pattern are brocade, wool blends, velveteen, and baby cord. So without further ado, here are the materials that I used for the version in this video.
We're going to be making View D today. For the main fabric, we're using the Minerva Core Range 2-in-1 Wale Cotton Baby Cord in the cobalt blue color. This color is really vibrant and unique, but there's also a big range of colors for this fabric. Our 21 Wale Cotton Baby Cord is 100% cotton and it's really, really soft. This fabric is 144 centimeters wide or 56.7 inches. For the lining, we're using the Minerva Core Range Anti-Static Super Soft Lining in color 134, which is a great match for the baby cord. This lining is indeed super soft and my absolute favorite lining to work with. It's soft and light without being too slippery, and it sews really nicely too. Plus, it comes in a whole rainbow of colors. The composition of this fabric is 100% polyester and it has a width of 160 centimeters or 63 inches. For interfacing, we're going with the Violin Vliazeline Medium Iron-On interfacing in white. For the buttons, we're using the hemline round fisheye buttons in royal blue. They measure 1.9 centimeters and have a really nice reflective quality. And finally, for thread, we'll use Gutermann Sew All Polyester Sewing Thread in color 232, or you can use our thread matching service if you choose a different color of fabric.
All of those materials are going to be listed in the description of this video as always, so you'll have everything you need to sew along with me. And don't forget to save this video so that you can sew along at your own pace.
After cutting our paper pattern pieces, we'll fold our fabric with right sides together and place the paper on top. As always, we'll want to keep the grain lines in mind, but in this case, we'll also need to consider the nap of the fabric. Baby cord is a kind of corduroy fabric, which is a kind of cotton fabric with cut pile ribs called wales. The wales can vary in thickness, which will in turn affect the thickness of the fabric. Corduroy is a napped fabric, which means it has a pile or short fibers that stand up from the fabric's base weave. Pile has a wrong and right direction. It will feel smooth if the pile is going down and rough if the pile is going up or against the nap. This is important when working with napped fabrics because the direction of the pile will make the fabric pieces vary in texture and even in color. The same fabric can appear a different shade when cut in a different direction. Therefore, we must treat napped fabrics like a directional print and cut out all of our pieces accordingly. On each pattern piece, there will be a long line with an arrow that indicates the grain line, so we'll make sure that that line is parallel with our selvages. Once all of the paper pattern pieces are correctly laid out on the fabric, we can go ahead and cut it out. While cutting the pieces out, we can also cut out the notches marked on the pattern. After all the pieces are cut, it's time to transfer the markings to the fabric. For tailored garments like this, I usually stitch mark the fabric. This means transferring the markings on the pattern using a combination of long basting stitches or tailor's tacks. This process is more time consuming than marking with pens or chalk, but I find it works really well for tailored pieces. Then we have to cut out our lining pieces and mark them too. Before we move on, we also have to cut out the interfacing and apply it. To fuse this interfacing, we'll use the iron-on medium heat for about 8 seconds. To make the darts on the upper front sections, we must first pin them in place, then stitch them, leaving long tails at the tip of the dart. We can then trim the excess to 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters and press it open, as well as tie off the thread tails and snip the excess. Next, we're going to pin the upper back sections together at the center back seam with right sides together and making sure to match the triple notches. Then we'll stitch that in place and press the seam open. Then we'll pin the upper side back sections to the back section with right sides together, making sure to match the notches. This is a princess seam, so it'll be slightly curved, and it's best to take your time in pinning and sewing. When we've stitched those in place, we can press the seams open. Now we can pin the upper back and upper front sections together at the shoulders and sides with right sides together, making sure to match the notches. Once all those seams have been stitched, we will press them all open. Before we start working on the collar, we're going to stay stitch the jacket neck edge between the large circles. Then we'll pin the undercollar sections together at the center back with right sides together, matching the triple notches. After stitching that in place, we can press the seams open. Next, we'll pin the undercollar to the neck edge with right sides together, matching the notches and the symbols. Carefully, we'll stitch that in place between the large circles. We'll then trim away the seam allowance and press it towards the undercollar. Now we can ease stitch the upper edge of the sleeve between the small circles. Adding 2 rows of large basting stitches will make them easier to work with later. Then we're going to pin the sleeve seam with right sides together, matching the notch. After stitching it in place, we'll press the seam open. I always try on my sleeves at this stage, and I found that this one was a little too tight, so I went back and stitched it with less seam allowance, and that worked a treat. After pressing the seam open, we'll also turn up 1 5/8 of an inch or 4 centimeters of the sleeve hem and press it. And then press the raw edge in too. Then we can go ahead and slip stitch the hem down by hand. Turning the raw edge in is a bit of an extra optional step. It just makes the process easier as the fabric can't really fray while you're sewing it. We can now set the sleeves in. To do so, we'll start by pinning the sleeve into the armhole with right sides together, matching the notches in underarm seam, and placing the large circle at the shoulder seam. Using our ease stitches, we'll adjust the ease to fit the sleeve in. However, as I sewed my sleeve with less seam allowance, I actually had too much ease and decided to turn that into a gather at the shoulder, but obviously that is optional. When the sleeves are all pinned in place, we can go ahead and stitch them down and then stitch them again 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters away in the seam allowance. This is a way to reinforce the seam. Then we'll trim close to the stitching and press the seam allowances towards the sleeve. We can put the jacket to the side to start working on the lining. First, we're going to stay stitch the side edge of the upper front facing between the notches. Then we'll pin the upper front lining to the upper front facing with right sides together and matching the notches. This is a very rounded princess seam, so we'll need to take our time both pinning and sewing. Once that's stitched in place, we can clip the curves by cutting some notches into the seam allowance and then press the seam open with the help of our tailor's ham. Now we can pin the upper back lining sections together at the center back seam with right sides together, matching the notches. When working with this lining, I like to change to a 70 sewing machine needle as it's smaller and more appropriate for lighter weight fabrics like this. After stitching, we'll press the seam open. Next, just like we did for the jacket, we're going to pin the upper side back lining sections to the side edges of the upper back lining. After stitching, we'll press the seams open. Then we can go ahead and pin the front and back lining sections together at the shoulders and sides with right sides together, making sure to match the notches. Again, once that's stitched in place, we'll press the seams open. Now we'll stitch the lining neck edge between the large circles, just like we did for the jacket. And after that, we'll pin the upper collar to the neck edge of the lining with right sides together, making sure to match the notches and symbols. Then we'll stitch that in place, trim, and press the seam allowances towards the upper collar. And while we have the iron on, we can also go ahead and turn in the seam allowance on the lower edge of the lining and press that in place. To make the sleeve linings, we're going to repeat the same steps as for the sleeves. So first we're going to E-stitch the upper edge of the sleeve linings between the small circles. Then we'll pin and stitch the sleeve lining seam, matching the notches. I stitched the lining with the same seam allowance that I used for the jacket sleeves, and if you make any alterations on the fly like this, it's important to replicate them in the lining. After pressing the seam allowance, it's time to set the sleeve lining into the jacket lining with right sides together, making sure all the notches and seams match up. We'll stitch that again, just like we did with the jacket sleeves, and then trim and press. Finally, we can pin the lining to the jacket with right sides together. We're going to stitch the front opening edges first, ending at the large circles and pivoting at the corner. We may have to stretch the front to fit. Then we'll stitch the collar edges together between the large circles, and again, we may have to stretch the under collar to fit. Before we move on, we have to trim those seams and clip our corners. After turning the jacket right side out and making sure to get the corners nice and crispy and slipping the sleeve linings in their rightful place, we're going to give the whole outer edges a really good press. Next, we'll lift up the lining and tack the neck seams together loosely by hand. Then we'll repeat that for the sleeves, tacking the lining and jacket seams together at the shoulders and underarms. After that, we'll turn the seam allowance in on the lower edge of the sleeve lining and place the folded edge 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch over the sewn edge of the hem. We'll then slip stitch that in place by hand. We can put the jacket to the side for now to work on the peplum. First, we're going to finish the long edge of the lower front self-facing. To do this, you may use whatever finishing technique you like. I did a narrow hem on this for a more professional finish. Next, we'll turn the self-facing to the inside along the fold line and press that in place. Before we move on, we'll also baste across the upper edge of the self-facing. Then we can stitch the lower back sections together at the center back, matching the triple notches. Because this section won't be lined, we need to finish our seams. And to finish these raw edges, we're going to fold both sides of the raw edges into the seam allowance so that they are hidden and stitch that down. I like to give that a quick press at the end too. Next, we can pin and stitch the lower front sections and lower back together at the sides with the right sides together and matching the notches. After stitching, we're also going to finish those seam allowances exactly the way we just did for the center back seam. Before we attach the peplum to the jacket, we'll give that upper edge a stitch just to help things stay put. Now we'll lift the lining to pin the peplum to the jacket along the bottom edge with right sides together, matching the notches and seams. Carefully, we can stitch that in place. And then when pressing, we'll make sure to press the seam allowance towards the jacket. Then we'll place the folded edge of the lining over that seam and slip stitch it by hand. I like to pin it in place first and then make my stitches as invisible as possible. Next, we're going to turn the lower edge of the self-facing of the peplum to the outside along the fold line and stitch across it 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters above the raw edge of the hem. Once that's sewn, we'll trim the facing like so. After turning the facing back to the inside, we'll turn up the hem too to form a narrow hem. First, we'll press the seam allowance up, and then fold the raw edges into that to hide them. You can stitch that down by machine, but I went ahead and slip stitched it by hand for an invisible finish. I also find it's easier to ease the fullness of the hem when sewing it by hand. And obviously, we mustn't forget to stitch the facing to the hem. To make the buttonholes, we can use some chalk to mark their placement using our previous stitch marking as guide, and then make them on the sewing machine. Using our buttonholes, we'll mark the placement of the buttons and sew them down too. You can sew them by hand or a machine depending on your preference, and sewing machine To make the belt, we'll stitch both belt pieces together with right sides together, leaving an opening. We can trim the excess seam allowance and then turn the belt right side out and press it. We'll then slip stitch the opening closed by hand. Next, we can make the buttonholes on the belt at the markings as we did for the jacket. Finally, we'll use the belt buttonholes as a guide to mark the button placement on the back of the jacket, matching the center of the belt with our center back seam, and then we're going to stitch the buttons down at the markings.
I'm really happy with how well this came out. I think that the fit is really good. I am really happy with the color of this fabric. It's so beautiful, it's so vibrant, and I think it's something that I could really easily wear in winter, but also in other seasons, because I think that even if it's a little bit cooler, you know, you're having a cooler spring, or maybe you live somewhere where it's a little bit colder, I think you could really easily wear this in spring and even autumn, depending on your style and how you pair it with. I also obviously really love that even though it's not a retro and not a vintage pattern, it still has like a little retro feel, and obviously depending on how you style it, you could really get a really authentic vintage look with this. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing your version of it though. If you do end up recreating this pattern, I would love to see it. So make sure you have an account on Minerva.com so you can share it with us and tag us so that we can see it. Creating an account on our website is totally free, and then you have access to all of the wonderful social features of the website. You can share photos and videos of the things you're making, the things you're planning on making, the things you've made. You can get advice on sewing, on all sorts of things. Everybody is really friendly and nice, and it's a really nice place to be. It's a really great place to meet like-minded people from all over the world, and it's just a really nice space. So I highly recommend. So that is everything for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!